Welcome back to another episode of Obsessed with Death. Thank you so much for continuing to listen and support the podcast. It is great to always jump on here in the beginning and just remind everybody that, this is a one-man show. I am doing this on my own. So any sort of promotion, any sort of, shout out, all that stuff helps a ton. Tell a friend about the podcast, post about it on social media, all of that stuff. Leave a review. If you haven't left a review, give us 5 stars, maybe write something nice, or give me 1 star and write a shit review if you hate it. Do whatever your heart desires. Either way, we have a great episode for you today with the hosts of the Two Girls with Grief podcast. I had Kendel and Rachel on the podcast. They recently started this show to help with their own grief and to help other people with their grief. I found them on TikTok, immediately made them become friends with me. We're now internet friends. I'm going to be on their podcast in a couple of weeks. I was so excited to have them on mine. I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. So please check out Two Girls with Grief podcast. Tell your friends about Obsessed with Death. And thank you for listening. And please enjoy another episode of Obsessed with Death. Thank you for both coming on the podcast. If you both don't mind, maybe Rachel, if you want to go first, if you could just introduce yourself and tell people who you are.
Yeah, I'm Rachel Dwyer. I live in San Francisco, California, and I co-host the Two Girls with Grief podcast with Kendel.
All right. Kendel, welcome to the podcast. If you wouldn't mind letting everybody know who you are as well.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kendel Rogers, and I'm based in the DFW area in Texas. I also am on the show with Rachel, and we just chit-chat about our grief and our losses.
I basically just found you on TikTok. I think it was TikTok, right?
Yeah,
it was TikTok. Instagram. Yeah. And I always get excited when I find new death podcasts because and I immediately just sent you a message and was like, please come on my podcast. And I want to come on you. I basically invited myself on yours. And it's exciting. I mean, I don't know, maybe exciting is the wrong word, but obviously there's certain things that lead you to have a death podcast, but it is still exciting. I got excited when I saw the podcast with the two of you because part of this is, looking to meet other people who are comfortable with talking about death. And it also helps that you had a podcast and, we're sort of, in the same world. So I'm glad the internet exists for the purpose of being able to find other death podcasters, and I'm excited to have you both on the show. The first question that I usually ask everybody when they come on the podcast is what your relationship with death is like. How much do you think about it? And obviously this might be a little silly considering you two host a podcast about death, but I still think it's an appropriate question to start the show off with. What is your relationship with death like? Do you think about it a lot? Is it something that worries you? What do you feel like your current relationship with death is like? Rachel, if you want to start, maybe.
Well, I've lost both my parents and my sister. With the podcast, I feel like I've never thought about death more and just loss and all of everything that it comes with. I think I dealt with it differently before, but with the podcast and with building a grief community, I've really had to almost like digest it more. And now we're talking about it weekly, and it's not just the days that we record, we're talking about it all the time. So we both have gotten comfortable speaking about death when I think previously we were more shy and like, I'm not say hidden, but we just didn't really talk about it. And now I think people that know us are like, oh, you have a podcast talking about grief and, death, which I think is a surprise for a lot of people that know us in real life.
The loss that you said, Rachel, you lost your parents and your sister.
Yes.
And was that all within a relatively close period of time?
Yeah. They passed about 2 years apart from each other. So from 2014 to 2018, my sister actually passed probably like a year and a few months, like 4 months after my dad passed. So like pretty quick succession
Yeah,
of death in between for that period. So yeah, it was a very dark period in my life.
sure.
That's for
Yeah,
sure. A little blurry when I look
yeah.
back.
Kendall, if you don't mind answering, what's your relationship with death like right now?
Ooh, I think same thing at some point. It was a very scary concept, something I didn't want to think about a lot. And then when my dad passed in 2020, it's in your face and it's a reality you're now confronting. Not only the loss of someone you love, but also the inevitable, the inevitable thing that you're also going to pass. And so confronting my own like mortality was a thing. So I think what happens, I think it's something both Rachel and I understand, I think, deeply is that you go from thinking your life is unlimited and it's never going to end and you're going to be young forever. And then when you have people pass, then you realize like, oh, you have a short amount of time to make something great and to make good in the world and make an impact. So I think the podcast is one way we're trying to help other grievers, try not to make the same mistakes we made, but also if they could take away some advice and it helps them, I think that's a win for us.
We're coming in on 2025 right now. So I mean, it's been a little time since you both were initially grieving. What was that period leading up to the podcast? How did the podcast get started? How did all of that happen?
Yeah, so I had been thinking about starting a grief podcast for probably, I think, 2 years now, and I just never knew the exact angle I wanted to take. I wasn't sure, do I want to have guests? Do I want to have this different, like, like a theme? Like, I wasn't sure, and it kept just getting stalled. It just never felt like the right time. And it was actually this year where I kind of looked at myself and how I was handling my grief and handling everything that I realized like I want to start doing more for my grief. And that's when I joined a grief support group. And there wasn't anything, there wasn't a group that fit exactly what I was looking for. So I ended up hosting my own through the dinner party. And they make you do this like 2-part training. And Kendall was actually in my training. And then she joined my group because I launched mine like the day after training. Like as soon as I could, I started my grief support group and Kendall signed up. And I think it was like after 2 meetings that I asked her if she wanted to start a grief support or not a grief podcast with me. And it was something in like her bio where she said that she had been dealing with grief, but she was in a place to finally start talking about it and help other grievers. And I felt like that I was in a similar space as well. And yeah, I asked her to do it and we just been rolling ever since. And now we're like best friends. Like we talk all the time. And yeah, it's been like this instant, like griefy bestie connection. And I feel like it's been really, I don't want to speak for Kendall, but it's been really good for me to have Kendall in my life. And it's just been a really interesting experience doing all these episodes and just very therapeutic, which we didn't expect, or at least I didn't expect it to be therapeutic to do all these, to dive into all these different topics.
No, yeah, I think Rachel covered our origin story pretty well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a drastic difference between conceptualizing grief within yourself and trying to handle it on your own versus when you meet someone who also gets it, and then you don't feel weird bringing up death. You don't feel weird crying randomly. You don't feel weird laughing about things that other people would think is inappropriate. Um, it's like just having Rachel as a grief best friend who, is in it, like thick in it with me is it's a privilege and it's like an honor to know Rachel and to go through this experience together.
You're basically becoming friends and also like learning how to navigate and start a podcast. This seems like it was Rachel's initial idea. Kendall, were you listening to podcasts? Was that like on your radar at all? Like what was your initial thoughts on starting something like that?
Well, I love podcasts already. Like
Yeah.
it's probably my main form of news and media intake.
Yeah.
And so when Rachel proposed it, I think I even just had an inkling like this is one great way that we're going to be able to touch reach so many people who are grieving right now and going through some of the worst moments of their life. And I think like both Rachel and I kind of think along the same similar line of like we went through really difficult experiences, but if our experiences can make someone else's mourning a little less bad, a little less lonely, then it makes my grief a little less hard, if that makes sense, a little less painful to know that we can help other people. It truly is like a community that has helped with the grief journey.
We have a nice little like grief support community. It's mostly girls, which I feel like is mostly women in these spaces in general from what I've seen. But yeah, it's also a great outlet for us. We talk about all these different things. We told them at our podcasts. A lot of them support us and listen to our episodes. So yeah, I think it's been great to just open up ourselves to just other grievers and like other friends that are grieving, where previously like didn't have any friends that I talk to about grief and just openly. And I think there's a difference of being able to just cry in front of somebody, like Kendel said, and you just get it and you're not judging someone. You're not trying to think about you like, oh, this is uncomfortable that they're crying, which I think a lot of people think like they don't like when their friends cry. And in the grief support group, we've all cried together. Like if someone cries, you know, it makes the other person cry. It just creates this comfortability with crying in front of others and not worrying about their feelings. And I think that's just been a really great experience for us. But yeah, Kendel, if you want to speak more about the grief support group.
Yeah, very tight knit. I mean, obviously you're going to bond really quickly when you're talking about the worst days of your life. And Rachel and I kind of joke that we're the elder ones. Sorry. That happens sometimes.
This is audio only, so that we're on Zoom right now, and we just for some reason a bunch of balloons just up on screen.
It's not a very celebratory topic, but yeah, there's balloons that just came up. But it's worse when we're on our podcast and like weird things start happening with my camera, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, Rachel. I don't know what's happening.
Well, I was just gonna say, if you're doing, you know, your grief group, and you know someone says their mom died, and then balloons just start going everywhere.
Yay! Join the group. You're a part of the club.
Not great timing.
Yeah, not good.
Or the best timing ever.
Yeah, it's all about.
Yeah, again, and you sort of mentioned this, right? It's like everybody sort of gets it, right? You're with a group of people that all get it, and you do feel like you could maybe make a joke that you couldn't make with other people.
Right.
Right? Like, okay, sure, we're talking about death, and all of a sudden a bunch of balloons pop up, or whatever it is. Like, yeah, maybe you wouldn't be comfortable around other people to laugh at that or whatever that is. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Kendel.
I don't even remember
It's okay.
what train I was on there, what train track I was on, but I guess like maybe to wrap it up and that we say it on our podcast, you know, we sometimes laugh and we sometimes cry, but you see it a lot in these spaces where people are like, you have to laugh about this because you're going to cry about this. And so I think Rachel and I have really tried to like acknowledge grief sucks, death sucks, loss sucks. Like it changes you, sometimes not for the best, but to try and find these little like modicum moments of joy and these moments where you don't see life shrouded in darkness, but just trying to take what has happened to you and make something good from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and this is, I don't know, maybe this is a weird way of putting it, but what I love about death is the community that it sort of creates with everybody else. I feel like one of the reasons why I started this podcast was like looking for community, right? And looking for people to talk to. I've said this a million times, but it's like, you know, I'm hanging out with my friends, we're at dinner, and I want to talk about death, and everyone's like, "What? No, I don't want to talk about dying right now. I'm trying to enjoy my dinner." And I get that it's not always the right space, but it's a conversation that I casually want to have sometimes, or I just something comes out, or I make a weird joke, whatever it is. I realize that, you know, it's not always appropriate, and I thought that maybe starting the podcast would be a great way to meet people and have these conversations and, you know, exercise that muscle of talking about death without burdening other people with it, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, community, I think, is such a big part of it. And obviously, being around other people that get it and understand what you're going through is like so important to being able to discuss it and feel comfortable discussing it and all of that. So yeah, it is interesting, I think, right, that death is like such this difficult thing where you lose somebody forever and it doesn't make sense, and grief is just this very difficult and confusing process. But at the same time, like if you do try and find the positives in it by going to a grief group and meeting other people and having these conversations, there's so much good that can come from losing someone.
Yeah. And I think one thing I realized was just how much of myself I was like, I don't, if the right word is like hiding
Yeah.
myself, because I feel like if you don't know my mom, my dad, my sister, if you don't know the loss that I've been through, if you don't know how challenging it's been, if you don't know just kind of the highs and lows of it all, like you don't really know me. And I think that was kind of a really big thought where I was like, do people even really know me anymore if they don't know that about me and I don't tell them about it. And it was kind of a big moment. Me and Kendall talked about it and it like made me cry because I was like, I sometimes I feel like people don't know me anymore because I don't share it and I've just kept it in for so long that it feels like I'm this other version of myself that's pretending like everything's okay all the time to kind of perform in society. And I realized I feel so much lighter and freer now that I don't do that. And I think that's been a really good takeaway from doing the podcast.
Yeah, I guess it's hard, right? It's hard to just like, what are you supposed to do? Like, send out an email to everybody and be like, hey guys, I'm a different person now.
Yeah.
Just in case you didn't know, I've multiple people in my life have died. I am now a completely different human being. Like, there's just no way to do that without,
Yeah.
at least for me, I think, with finding an outlet to express those feelings. Or I guess you could sit all of your your friends down individually and be like, I just got to tell you, I feel like I'm a different, but like, I don't know. Who has time to even do that? I barely can see
Yeah.
my friends in general. I'm not going to schedule a meeting to let them know that I feel like, my brain chemistry is different now. It's a difficult thing to find the right space for, which again, I think is why podcasting is so great. It's like this long form space where you could just talk, and obviously with other people. It's why I was so drawn to it, just because I love like just like listening to two people have a conversation. Of course, it depends on the subject matter, but I think if they have an interesting topic or obviously something I'm interested in, there's obviously different versions of podcasts. You could learn, educational, whatever, murder podcasts. People seem to really love listening to people get murdered or who was murdered. But Kendall, that look, are you a big murder podcast fan?
Yeah, and even when listening to a couple of your episodes and like the label was like true crime, and I was like, I mean, is this true crime? I mean, this is more like just open conversations around death, but yeah, I don't know where else you would put this. There's not space for death in our media, not in our society,
Yes,
Unless
it
they're
was.
murdered.
unless they're murdered.
Unless somebody kidnaps you and you get a Netflix documentary, nobody wants to put a label. Yeah, that was a very weird. Like, I think I changed the label of the podcast for on Apple to like lifestyle and education or something. But yeah, when I first started doing the podcast, I didn't know where to put it. I didn't. There was like nothing that really made sense. I mean, I guess you could call it kind of educational because I am interviewing like doctors and author. Like I'm speaking to people much smarter than me. So there is I'm at least learning something. So that kind of makes it educational, and I hope people that are listening learn. But yeah, that it's so interesting that you say that because yeah, it is that was such a difficult. So I put true crime because it was like, well, if people are listening to other podcasts that are death related, then maybe this would be interesting to them. But it is very different than, a murder podcast. But yeah, it's back to what we were saying. There isn't really a space, at least in podcasting, that's like designated for that kind of conversation, I guess.
And I was just gonna say, I don't even know what we're listed as. I looked at a bunch of different grief podcasts, and I think everyone was listed as something different in terms of
Really?
like their. So I don't even know what we have. I think I've changed it a few times,
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't even know what it's listed right now. I can't say that for sure because everyone had a different take on it. So I was like, I don't know, what are we supposed to be listed as? It's not just like grief, which I feel like it's a big enough topic that it should be its own thing
Yeah.
Gonna happen to
because
everybody.
yeah, everyone's gonna do that at some point. But yeah, I don't know what you should be listed as.
Yeah, I just looked up mine. For Apple Podcasting, I'm listed now under society and culture.
Oh,
I
Ooh.
mean,
fancy.
it does make me sound very fancy, but I don't know. Do I fall under that umbrella? Maybe more than true crime. Definitely more than true crime because I'm not talking about any
Yeah.
crime. But yeah, it is sort of difficult to find, I guess, the right space. I will say this though, again, finding you both on TikTok, there is such a like death community world going on TikTok, which I absolutely love. Like there's a lot of stuff that's kind of difficult to watch where, I saw a video, I don't know, not that long ago where it was like a kid, like a little kid riding his bike through like a cemetery to like go say hi to his mom. And I'm like, I emotionally, I cannot handle watching this video at 9 a.m. or whatever.
Yeah.
But there'll be other people, there was like a couple of like TikTok trends where there was like people at funerals. I don't know if you saw any of those videos
Oh
where it was
yeah.
like they were like pretending to be at a concert, but they were at like their mom's funeral or something. I forget exactly. But the beauty of TikTok is like there is, and my algorithm is like all death now because it's like all I post is death stuff, and like all I do is just like my entire algorithm is all like mostly like 90% death videos. Do you partake in the internet death videos? Are we watching that stuff or no?
Yeah. Well, I mostly handle our TikTok and Kendall mostly handles our Instagram. And I feel like
Okay.
more of the trends are on TikTok and sometimes they go to Instagram. But I have like one account where I also post like grief stuff, and then I have our Two Girls with Grief podcast one, and then I have like a separate one which is just like cute animals and like hot guys that like is definitely like a diffusion. When I'm like, I can't watch any more
Yeah.
grief videos, I go to
Yeah.
that account just to like for fun, like shits and giggles. But
Yeah.
yeah, those two accounts, it's like everything is like it's a grief story, it's a grief trend, it's something, it's hard hitting. So I definitely get a lot of those, but it could be anything that makes me cry. And I feel like I probably frequently cry watching TikTok because of those algorithms. But I've told Kendall, like, I've cried over watching a video of Kendall Jenner and Kylie Jenner just hugging in this like vase because they were like hugging. It was like a hugging imprint of them, like they were hugging, and that was going to be like the base. And that just made me think of like, oh, hugging my sister, and that made me cry. So like, it doesn't take
Yeah.
much to make me cry. It doesn't have to be a grief specific video to make me cry. Like the tears are just ready to flow. But it does give me sometimes like it. Sometimes it makes me remember things that I forget because it has been a while now. My dad passed 10 years ago, my sister 8 years ago, my mom 6 years ago. So sometimes like those also jog your memory, which is weird. It's like you forget things that happened. And sometimes seeing those videos, you're like, oh, that really did suck. That that really hurt. And I did go through something similar. So yeah, it's a whirlwind of experiences. But I don't know, Kendall, what about on Instagram? What's going on over there?
Yeah. Do you also have an account for hot guys and kittens?
On my personal account, it's a lot of food videos and traveling, but
Okay.
on our
Okay.
two girls one, yeah, it's a lot of I mean, we've definitely cultivated and followed a lot of other death content creators. I hate to say it like that, but I don't know how else you would. And we've like created a lot of friends like on other accounts and just very supportive. It's amazing how kind people are in this death space. I think that's like been one really surprising thing, at least for me. I don't want to speak for Rachel, but like people are just really kind when they're going through it. Like I think it's because we all get it. It's like this is hard and this sucks, and but we can make it easier for each other.
Yeah, the perspective I think is very deep in the death world,
Yeah.
and it sort of makes people, I think, a little bit more understanding and kind towards other people. And
Absolutely.
I think it takes sort of a certain type of person to be comfortable enough and be willing to like get on the internet and be vulnerable like that and talk about that stuff. So you're probably going to be, I think, nicer to strangers if you're like also making, videos about your friends and family dying.
Yeah.
Something that you
Yeah.
mentioned though that's interesting, Kendall, too, is like, yeah, calling them like a death influencer or like what that is. And I that's something else that I think about too, right? Because I'm definitely not like an influencer. I'm not trying to sell anything. I mean, the podcast is I've been doing it now for like a little over 5 years, and there have
Oh,
been
wow.
like death companies, like people that are in like this death space, like that sell caskets or urns or certain things that have reached out to me and have wanted to come on the podcast and like will sponsor episodes, and it's sort of turned into like a little bit of a business in that way, which I didn't really expect. Or I'm not like a salesperson. I don't know how to like sell people on my death podcast, but it is sort of interesting how it still eventually did sort of move in that direction a little bit. And again, I'm not like an influencer by any means. I'm just like doing a podcast because I legitimately can not talk about death. Like it just I have to find some way to talk about it, at least, a few times a week. I don't know. It's gotten better. But yeah, I don't know. It's definitely an evolving thing. I think there's always been, like a deaf community, but with the internet and especially TikTok now, it's definitely growing into like a much bigger thing, obviously with podcasts, but you know, yeah, there are sort of becoming these like deaf influencers. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's great. I think that we need more people to be comfortable talking about death because I think everybody should be talking about death. It's not obviously the most fun topic at times, but I'll say this at least, like I didn't I hadn't lost anybody close to me when I started the podcast. There was no like mom died or sister died, like none of that. I hadn't I had like my great grandparents died. That was like it. I wanted to start a death podcast for a totally different reason. And then within the 5 years of doing this podcast, I've had three very close people I've known for 20 plus years all die in the past five
Oh,
years.
wow.
And obviously it was horrible. And, there was a death anniversary 2 weeks ago of a friend that it's been 2 years since she died. And obviously it's not fun, but I will say that the fact that I've been doing this podcast for so long and like consistently talking about death, it was so much easier, or I felt like I was better prepared
Hmm.
for the loss, like just because I'm having these conversations. I'm reading books. I've gotten so many, I've read so many great books just because of the podcast. I don't know if you're a big reader,
We're
but
huge readers.
oh my gosh, okay, this is
Yeah.
any chance I get to plug this book. It's called The Grieving Brain. And so it's this neuroscientist. Her name is Mary Frances O'Connor. She actually teaches down in Tucson, and she studies people's brains while they're actively grieving.
Wow.
Within, I don't know, weeks, I think it is, of this person losing somebody, she will, get in contact with them. However, she gets in contact with them, I think people will reach out to her. And she will literally hook them up to machines and will ask them questions and have conversations and like study their brains and like learn how your brain changes and what happens to your brain while you're grieving. It's one of the best books I've ever read in my entire life.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think exposing yourself to grief even before it happens is helpful. I think not only for you going into the situation, but for like friends and family, because I think you hear so many people like losing friends, losing family because of just how they reacted to your grief and them not understanding it at all. We had one of our listeners, he lost his wife and he said that his friends are listening to the podcast because they want to better understand what he's going through. And I thought like that is so nice. And I wish that I had something like that at the time when I was going through it initially because I felt so separated from my friends because I just like had this, I lost my dad and it's like then I lost my sister and then I lost my mom and it's like I didn't even want anyone to look at me. Like I felt like that was kind of my feeling because it just felt like no one's going through this, even though other people have dealt with it, obviously. But it felt like I'm the only one. This sucks. Like all of this is so much. And I wish that I had been in a situation where I was like, oh, I found a podcast that I really resonated with, and my friends are listening to it because they care and they want to understand it with me. I just like it's just been a really great experience because us not knowing how to deal with it and then talking through it has helped other people kind of make better steps in their grief quicker than we did.
If they do have outlets like your podcast and other podcasts that are going to really get into the details and explain what you were going through, there's a ton of value in that. I mean, that's amazing that their friends even had the foresight to be like, oh, well, I clearly don't understand what this person's going through. Let me try and find some sort of outlet that can educate me on, what they're going through.
Yeah, we have a episode dedicated to just the supporters and the friends of people who are grieving. And like, especially if your friend is gone through a loss for the first time, you don't know how to support them. You don't know the right words to say. And Rachel and I have heard, I think, every line in the book that people tell you to make you feel better. And we both know it didn't help. So trying to like help give a guide to those friends who are like, hey, I know someone who just like lost their parents and I don't know what to say and I don't know what to do and I don't know how to help. I just feel really bad for them. And so we made a podcast episode just for them, being like, here are some things that you can take away and that will help a griever like actually feel better about maybe that position they're in. It's not going to take away their grief by any means, but knowing that they have a support system, because that's something else I think Rachel and I experienced a lot is like you go through a loss and like you said, you're changing chemically as a person. You're coming out the other end, a very different personality, and you're going to lose friends along the way. And that's also like something you don't know until you're going through it. And you're like, dang, where did those friends that I thought I had for life? Like, they're not here anymore. And like, how do you even rationalize that you're going to lose parts of your life that you had prior to your loss versus afterwards?
Maybe you're sitting in your grief, right, and you're spending probably more time alone than you should, and whatever you're doing to sort of get through that like early grief stage. I think a part of it too, and maybe you don't realize it while it's happening, but I think a lot of people are scared to talk to people who are grieving, right? Like
Yeah.
they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't know what to say. It also makes them uncomfortable because now they have to think about mortality relating to themselves and to their family. I think that there's multiple reasons why people don't reach out to someone who's grieving, whether it makes them uncomfortable or they don't know what to say. They've never been through it, obviously. So having outlets like your podcast is great. It's a great resource for people. Obviously, I think people don't realize that stuff is out there, right? So it's important for us to be making not important. It's not our job, I guess, but I think it's great. I love, it's not, maybe it's not something you want to see when, you're starting your day at 9 o'clock in the morning, but it's good to get on TikTok and be reminded that you're going to die one day, and it's like you were saying, like we're all going to experience it. We're all going to die and we're all going to experience people that we love dying. That's unfortunately just like part of life. So yeah, it sucks and you're going to be sad and the whole thing, but it's like, wouldn't you rather be prepared, and wouldn't you rather be prepared to comfort your friends and your family? I don't know.
I think a lot of people are afraid to say something. And when they do, it's like they're trying to fix it because they're like, oh, we're a solution oriented society. I can offer something and it's going to fix the problem. And there's no solution for someone dying. Like once they're gone, that just kind of ricochets into a whole bunch of different shit that affects the rest of your life. And I think once we figure that out, like, okay, you're not going to fix it, but you just need to show up as a friend because I think people get so scared of like, I'm going to piss them off. I'm going to hurt their feelings. I'm going to do this and that. And the reality is like, you just need your friends to actually show up and seem like they care. and are trying, even if they don't understand what you're going through, are gonna keep trying. And so a lot of our tips were like, don't make it about you, because I think that happens too. It's like if someone doesn't answer your calls, they don't respond to your texts, they don't want to hang out. Like we said, like you change as a person and you're just really sad for a while. Or, for some people it's like forever. Everyone handles it differently. So I think those are kind of the main things that come to my mind, is just like, don't give up on your friend and don't make it about you. And
Yeah, I think leaning into the awkward. Obviously, these are not conversations we're having all the time with the closest people, and that's okay. But this is still a part of life, and you're like a griever is going to make mistakes, a friend is going to make mistakes, and to have that grace towards each other, and just know that it's going to be hard and awkward, but those those things are going to lead to great conversations. It's really going to lead to healing for that person. And so to not be scared of having that hard conversation with them, and even if you don't know even how to comfort somebody with grief, I think that's okay to say, like, I don't know how to comfort you, but I'm willing to learn and figure it out with you. Because oftentimes as a griever, if it's your first time going through it, you don't know what you need. I didn't know what I needed. I was figuring it out as I went and was like, now in retrospect, I could be like, oh yeah, I needed more support here, or I could have, had more understanding there. But having that open and honest kind of like clarity for each other, I think is a huge thing. We need that more of that in society in general.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, embracing like the awkwardness of just like everyday life, I think would make everybody a little bit, it would make things for everybody a little bit easier, life a little bit easier, if you could just like, oh, that was awkward, or this is gonna be awkward, and I'm gonna do it anyway, and I'll probably feel great afterwards, and it probably won't be that awkward for that long. Like once you sort of get into like the meat of whatever it is, I think the awkwardness sort of goes away. Sort of what you said too, Rachel, about, you're not gonna, this is something you literally can't fix, right? Just quickly to that book, I was the grieving brain, something that she mentions in the book that I thought was so interesting was she compared it to losing a limb and basically how the brain works, right? So when people lose like half their arm or half their leg, at a certain point they all say, "Oh, I could still feel that part of my arm. Like it's gone, but I could feel it." And so that's basically just your brain problem solving. It's going, "Okay, I can't grow a new arm, but I could make you feel like it's there, and then the problem's solved. Your arm's gone forever, but we're going to pretend like it's there and you're going to feel it." And that's how powerful the brain is. When somebody dies, it's another problem for the brain, and that's what grieving is. And it cannot fix that problem. And that's why people grieve for the rest of their lives. And that's why grief is so hard in the beginning, because not only are they just obviously sad from losing somebody, but their brain is like almost having like a panic attack because it's realizing it can't fix this problem. And whatever that does to your brain is obviously not good. So, yeah, I mean, there is no fixing it. I think it's just obviously time sort of helps, and having good people to comfort you or going to some sort of like grief group, I think is great. And or listening to some really cool death podcasts, that
Subtle plug.
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
also is something you could do. Um
Yeah.
I'm so glad that I found you both on the internet and that we're now internet podcast friends. Is there like an end goal? What do you think? Are you two just going to become best friends and just like soar into the horizon and do this podcast forever? What's like the end goal here?
On unicorns, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I was picturing you both. You both had your own unicorn, but you could like be on one together if you want, whatever, whatever works. But is there like is there an end goal, or are you two just gonna just do a podcast forever? What do you think?
I'd say, I don't know forever, but definitely for the foreseeable future. I think we've seen kind of the impact that we can make through just like so many different conversations we've had with people with the podcast. And yeah, I think we're just like, I don't want to say like dream big for a podcast or about grief, but I think it really needs to be talked about more. So the podcast is going on until we lose our voice or or anything that happens. And yeah, I mean, we're trying to move forward with different ways that we want to make it a little bit more exciting. We have like a grief book club that we do, and we rotate reading different grief stories. Kendall leans towards darker grief stories. I lean towards like fictional, lighter grief stories. And that's just been a fun thing to do in itself. And we've had a lot of good conversations surrounding that. But yeah, I mean, I think we have the podcast. You can expect it to happen. The support group, I think, has been really good for us. So we're continuing to do that. Yeah, we have like a bunch of like plans for 2025. A lot of it's expanding. We want to do like retreats with other grievers. I think that's always been really helpful. We always talk about nature being like a major, I don't want to say healer, but it makes you feel a little bit better somehow. I don't know, in the cosmos somehow. Being in amongst nature makes you just feel a little bit more connected to them, a little bit lighter. But yeah, we have plans for like retreats, kind of doing something bigger with the book club and the grief book club, and just continuing to grow the grief podcast. I feel like we've come a long way since the start, but we're still like a small and growing podcast. So yeah, I think on unicorns is probably a good way to, we're going to fly away on unicorns with grief.
I'm picturing that if you ever decide to do some new artwork for the podcast, I'd love to see the two of you on unicorns.
We'll start working on that. We'll give it to our producer.
Yeah, hey, I know a guy who makes some great death
Right.
artwork.
Yeah.
I'll shoot him an email, see what he's got going on. Well, the podcast is Two Girls with Grief. It's on all the podcasting Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Are you? Is the podcast on
Yeah.
YouTube? Yeah. It's go check out the podcast. Follow them on Instagram and TikTok and all those things. And I'm so glad you're doing this. I'm very excited to start listening to the podcast more. And yeah, I'm excited to have some new death friends. So I'm sorry.
death friends.
I'm
Yeah.
forcing my friendship onto you now. So
We'll take it.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a ton of fun. And I think the next plan is for me to go on your podcast. So make sure you go check
Yes.
that out as well. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank
Our
you.
first ever.
You did great. First one, nailed
Thank
it.
you.
All right.